Now, as all of you know that duodenal tumor is of three types: epithelial, mesenchymal, and miscellaneous. Under miscellaneous, there is a familial adenomatous polyposis, Gardner syndrome, Peutz-Jeghers syndrome, and duodenal gangliocytic paraganglioma. And under epithelial, there is adenoma and Brunner's gland adenoma. Now, first case is my 36-year-old male presented with recurrent melena for 1 year, leading to anemia. Appetite was normal, no history of pain abdomen, jaundice, no history of NSAID intake or bleeding disorder. On general examination, patient was anemic. Examination of abdomen revealed no abnormality. On investigation, hemoglobin was 7.5. On upper GI endoscopy, there is a big growth seen in posterior wall of D1 of surface of which few ulcers were seen. D2 was normal. Biopsy was taken that revealed a non-specific hyperplastic polyp. So, this is a bleeding duodenal polyp. So, laparotomy, we consider the laparotomy after correction of anemia. So, laparotomy was done, and there was a big mobile mass was palpable in first part of duodenum. Other abdominal organs were normal. So, a pedunculated mass seen arising from the posterior wall of duodenum. Duodenectomy closed in two layers. This is a duodenum cut open. This is a tumor with long pedicle, and this is an excited specimen. So, on histopathological examination, it was revealed that it's a Brunner gland adenoma. This is a histopath. The second case was a multiple small nodular lesion in first part of duodenum. On histopathological, this is also a Brunner's gland hyperplasia. And third case, 47 years old male with dyspepsia, no history of weight loss, no hematemesis or melena. On endoscopy, there is a large polyp more than 5 cm with lobulated surface in second part of duodenum. Biopsy was adenomatous polyp with low-grade dysplasia. On contrast-enhancing CT of abdomen, there is an intraluminal hypodense lesion in second and third part of duodenum with no obvious infiltration to surrounding tissues. So, laparotomy and excision of the tumor was done. And this is first picture shows the distended second part of duodenum, and so we gave a stay suture and duodenectomy is done. So this is a specimen after the duodenectomy. So this is a defect after surgery, and that is being closed. This is the excised mass. So on histopathology, it was a tubulovillous adenoma. So duodenal polyp may be a carcinoid, papillary adenoma, tubular adenoma, Brunner's gland adenoma, hyperplastic polyp, tubulovillous adenoma, which is sessile polyp, and occasionally it may be pedunculated. So Brunner's gland adenoma is a very rare tumor. It is a duodenal hematoma with predominance of Brunner's gland element. And microscopic type are described. It is a diffuse, circumscribed, and adenomatous. So, single polyp may be endoscopically snared, and large polyp more than 2 cm requires surgical dissection. Treatment of duodenal polyposis is now pancreas-sparing duodenectomy. The fourth case is a 47 years old female with chronic diarrhea and weight loss. On histopathological examination, AFB positive, and tuberculosis of duodenum in a case of AIDS. HIV test was found to be positive. So tuberculosis of duodenum is also a very rare, and one presented as a duodenum obstruction in 19 years old. Second case was with nodular lesion in D1 with cold abscess near the supraduodenal area in 36-year-old lady. So in fifth case, there is a 50 years old female with mucous lipoma of the first part of duodenum. So it is also resected endoscopically. Second case was a 23 years old male presented with anemia and intermittent melena for 8 months. There is a loss of body weight for more than 2 months, and patient was transfused 7 units of blood. General examination was normal. An examination of abdomen revealed a 6 into 4 centimeter mass occupying the right hypochondrium epigastrium. Upper GI endoscopy, there is a prepyloric congestions, and duodenum was on the duodenum there was small erosions. On ultrasound of abdomen, mixed echogenic mass near the head of pancreas in the region of D2. Now, well encapsulated soft tissue mass was found on contrast enhancing CT abdomen. On CT guided FNAC, this was the benign spindle cells. Plan was correction of anemia after laparotomy. Laparotomy after correction of anemia. So, pre-op finding was a 6 into 5 centimeter irregular highly vascular tumor, medial and posterior wall of duodenum, inseparable from pancreas. And this is a preoperative picture. There is Whipple procedure done. There is a excised specimen, and on histopathological, it was a leiomyosarcoma of the duodenum. So, CT abdomen after 4 months and after 1 year were normal. Discussion: tumor in duodenum is uncommon. 60% small gut tumors is a benign, and most common benign duodenal tumor is adenoma. 1/3 duodenal tumor is malignant, and leiomyosarcoma of duodenum is very rare. Nearly 10% of patients with familial adenomatosis polyposis develop severe duodenal polyposis, and malignant potential of duodenal polyposis in FAP is quite high. Treatment of duodenal polyposis is now pancreas sparing duodenectomy. So, it's a better prognosis than CA duodenum and head of pancreas. A leiomyosarcoma of duodenum, that is 80% of the leiomyosarcoma of this small bowel. It's only 9 cases reports in last 10 years.
Okay, Dr. Singh, what is your experience in Southeastern Railway? You're working here about the varied types of presentation of duodenal tumors. What is your series? That is what I want to know.
Sir, it's a very rare tumor. So, mainly the patient presented with severe anemia or some...
how many duodenal tumors have you come across as an operator or your faced?
Only 2, sir.
Okay. So, this is basically a reflection of some other study. Okay. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Singh.
Thank you, Dr. Dilip. Now we have Dr. R. Nagvani, DNB, Obstetrics and Gynecology. She is going to present outcome of obstetric cholestasis in pregnancy, a study from May 2011 to April 2013 in Central Hospital, Garden Reach. Dr. R. Nagvani, please.
A very good morning to all the chairpersons and delegates present here. I'm Dr. Nagvani, and I'm going to present a prospective study which was conducted in Central Hospital Southeastern Railway of outcome of pregnancy in obstetric cholestasis. Obstetric cholestasis is the most common liver disease presenting during pregnancy. It's also called intrahepatic cholestasis of pregnancy, cholestatic hepatosis, jaundice of pregnancy, pruritus gravidarum, and icterus gravidarum. The incidence being 1.2 to 1.5% women of Indian Asian origin. It's characterized by onset in the 2nd or 3rd trimester of pregnancy. It's characterized by pruritus, which is mostly occurring in the night and mainly involving palms and soles, with elevated serum aminotransferases and bile acid levels, with spontaneous relief of signs and symptoms after delivery. The etiology being multifactorial, with genetic, environmental or hormonal factors being involved. And the diagnosis is mainly done by excluding other causes of pruritus and abnormal liver function tests. In untreated cases, the perinatal mortality reaches up to 11 to 20% and the recurrence rate being 80 to 90% in subsequent pregnancies. The condition typically resolves within 48 hours of women giving birth, with biochemical markers predominantly becoming normal within 2 to 4 weeks postnatally. And the treatment of choice is ursodeoxycholic acid. Now this decreases the maternal symptoms and enhances the fetal outcome. The main aim and objective of my study was to study the incidence of obstetric cholestasis in the study population, its occurrence in the period of gestation, and its relationship with maternal age and parity, to study the maternal outcome in relation to incidence of caesarean section rate and postpartum hemorrhage, to study the fetal outcome in reference to preterm labor, fetal distress, meconium staining of amniotic fluid, low birth weight, intrauterine fetal death, and NICU admission rate. This prospective study was done in the outpatient department of obstetric and gynecology, Central Hospital, Southeastern Railway, from May 2011 to April 2013. All pregnant women presenting with pruritus or abnormal liver function on blood examination, diagnosed first time during antenatal period, were included in the study, and the exclusion criteria being any history of jaundice or biliary disease or gallbladder disease prior to pregnancy, any other medical condition causing pruritus, congenital or acquired condition of hepatobiliary system, abnormal ultrasound of liver and biliary tract in pre-pregnant state, and any history of hepatotoxic or allergic drug intake in the past. The patients were identified and diagnoses were based on clinical examinations, laboratory results showing a cholestatic pattern, that is aspartate and alanine transferring exceeding 40 units per liter, with no signs of viral hepatitis, and normal ultrasound of the liver and biliary tract. Informed consent was taken, and the sample size in our study was 94. Complete history regarding evaluation of risk factors, routine general, systemic examination monthly, routine blood tests, and ultrasound for fetoplacental profile were done. Ursodeoxycholic acid were offered to all patients with moderate to severe symptoms in doses of 300 to 600 milligram per day. Maternal and fetal outcome were noted, and mothers were followed postnatally after 6 weeks for resolution of symptoms and normalization of liver function tests. Coming to the results and analysis, the total number of pregnancy cases observed during my study period was around 1,488, out of which 94 cases were diagnosed of obstetric cholestasis. So incidence of obstetric cholestasis in my study was 6.3%, which is slightly on a higher range compared to most of the Indian population, which is around 1%. The relationship of obstetric cholestasis with parity, it's more prevalent in multigravida, which is mostly consistent with other studies, also showed that multigravida are more affected compared to primigravidas. And some authors have reported that women of relatively advanced age, that is more than 35 years, are at increased risk of developing this disease, but we found in our study that the mean age was around 28.7 years. And in 52.1% women, this was diagnosed in the third trimester, which is similar to seen in most of the studies. Hence, screening of the women in 32 to 36 weeks of gestation is mandatory. Generalized pruritus was the cardinal symptom in all and was most pronounced in the palms and soles in 94% of the women, and 86.17% of the patients presented with pruritus along with abnormal liver function tests. There is an increased risk of delivery by cesarean section overall. In our study, the cesarean section rate was around 27%, which is almost similar to the other studies, and compared to the vaginal deliveries, which was almost 68%. Response to ursodeoxycholic acid treatment. Several studies demonstrate that in addition to providing safe and effective relief of pruritus, it improves the LFTs and it also improves the perinatal outcome. The complete resolution of symptoms occurred in 44% of the patients, and the biochemical improvement were noted in around 93% of the patients. And postpartum hemorrhage has been observed in 2 to 25% of patients in some studies, which is almost similar to our study. Even now, the incidence of postpartum hemorrhage was around 26%. And postpartum resolution of pruritus and liver function tests were seen in 100% of the patients within 6 weeks of delivery. Coming to the incidence of fetal outcomes and neonatal morbidities, the incidence of preterm labor in our study was 14%, which is slightly on a lesser range compared to the other studies, which showed around 44%. The incidence of fetal distress in our study was 19% and incidence of low birth weight was around 20%, which is similar to that shown in other studies too. The incidence of meconium stained LICA and was around 36%, which is also consistent with most of the other studies. And the incidence of intrauterine fetal death in our study was around 2%. Coming to the conclusion, the incidence is high in our hospital being a referral unit, so larger studies are needed to assess the correct incidence in the general population. Obstetric cholestasis has adverse maternal, fetal and neonatal outcome, hence early detection, close monitoring to reduce the perinatal mortality is required. The rate of operative delivery, including instrumental vaginal delivery and cesarean section rate, are raised in obstetric cholestasis. It increases with the maternal age, parity and gestational age. Ursodeoxycholic acid treatment is associated with marked symptomatic and biochemical improvement, and the neonatal morbidity is mainly due to prematurity, low birth weight and meconium staining of amniotic fluid.
Okay. You showed that multi-gravida had slightly higher incidence. Do you think this condition tends to recur with subsequent pregnancies?
Yeah, it tends to recur in around 60 to 70% of the patients in subsequent pregnancy.
Okay. And what could be the cause of higher PPH as a complication? You showed in one of your slides that postpartum hemorrhage was more. So what could be? Has it got some link with coagulopathy or coagulation disorder due to jaundice itself?
Because of the prolongation of the prothrombin time and because of the abnormal liver function test, it affects
Cholestasis is due to, how do you say that the cholestasis is due to abnormal liver function? Only due to abnormal liver function. What is the abnormality of liver function to the level that it can cause this outcomes of delivery?
In this
Yes.
obstetric cholestasis, the abnormal liver function tests are mainly the elevated the aminotransferase and the bile acid level. It's mainly because of the bile acid level the fetal outcomes are affected.
When I ask you the level of, suppose the LFT levels, how it is related to the outcomes? Because cholestasis, mild, moderate or severe, suppose it is only, it is a level goes 100 and it sometimes is 500. How do you correlate? That you have assessed in these cases, all cases you have taken uniformly, or you have assessed that suppose the cholestasis level according to the cholestasis and presence of associated inflammation, time of during gestation, it is important.
Means LFT results are related to the outcome. The more deranged the LFT, the more grave the prognosis. Is that so?
Yes, sir. The more raised the LFTs are, we have seen more occurrence of meconium staining of amniotic fluid and fetal distress.
Other things, this your delivery assisted, normal delivery
Yes.
and assisted delivery, whatever you forceps, other things, how it is related to the cholestasis?
Actually,
I think it is a coincidence finding, how it will be related to the delivery process.
delivery, actually the cesarean section rate is increased because of the fetal distress. We tend to do early delivery, early intervention in the pregnancy.
So what is your message to the crowd? Do we routinely go for a liver function test in the second trimester?
Yeah, most of the actually studies have shown, earlier that routine LFT, screening is not required. But since due to the rampant of increase in the incidence of obstetric cholestasis, the screening of liver function tests in at least early third trimester is a must. So that at least we can rule out at least what are the causes of fetal distress, and we can timed intervention must be done.
And how did you carry on the antenatal screening in these cases? Anything special? Any for the fetal well-being?
In case we come across any low birth weight, then we do the NSTs, which is done twice a week, and biophysical profile and with Doppler study.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nagvani. Dr. Neha Kumari.
Excuse me, Dr. Neha unfortunately is down with dengue. So we are fortunate and lucky that Dr. Binidro has again volunteered to present a paper, a study of clinical and investigation profile of dengue fever at Central Hospital, Garden Ridge. Dr. Binidro.
Once again, good morning to my respected chairpersons, all my respected teachers, seniors, and dear colleague. I'm doing more of a filling the next job here, but I take great pleasure in doing it. So this study we are presenting, it's an epidemiological study of around 72 cases of dengue based on their clinical, ultrasonographic, and other parameters. So this study was conducted from August 2012 to November 2012, which was a period of epidemic break of dengue in this part of the state. So out of the 196 cases that presented with acute febrile illness, 72 satisfied the criteria of acute fever with thrombocytopenia with serology for dengue positive, and hence they were taken for the study. Now, being a referral center, we received cases from all over the southeastern region. The bulk of the cases were, of course, from our own Garden Reach. We have also complicated cases of dengue referred from various divisions like Adra, Kharagpur, Shalimar, and a good number of cases from Satragachi. So, around 15 of the patients came with NS1 positive done outside. 67 cases were positive for dengue IgG for 20 cases, and a combination of NS1 and one of the two serological markers were present in 15 and 70 cases respectively. So, this is the most important part, coming to the distribution based on age group. Patients aged from 1 year of age to 72 years were part of this study. We have such a vast range, and we have seen that the relatively younger age group, that is from 11 to 20 years, were the majority, comprising of 61% of all the cases. And amongst these, 16 cases were female and 10 were males. Now, if we go to the 4-stage classifications, so out of the 72 cases, 14 of the cases were of dengue fever with low platelet count. Dengue shock syndrome was present in 41, that is 56%, almost half of the cases, and 24 were unfortunate enough to develop dengue hemorrhagic fever. And also, once again, in this, 30 cases were of male, where predominantly it was the dengue fever with low platelet count or dengue shock syndrome, whereas in females 43% were having dengue fever with low platelet, and remaining 18% were dengue shock syndrome, and only 5% developed dengue hemorrhagic fever. So based on the clinical presentation, of course, since fever is one of the criteria to select the cases, all 72 cases had fever. Body ache was also common in around 64% of the patients. And surprisingly, pain abdomen, which is often neglected in a case of dengue, was found in 47 cases out of 72. So this is one slide showing the typical rash. This is over the dorsum aspect. And on the same patient, we can see generalized rash present. So usually skin rash, headache, and prolonged fever were the major presentations of the patients in our study. Now, as we have seen, pain abdomen is present in 65% of patients with dengue fever, and almost 60% patients with dengue shock syndrome also develop pain abdomen. Once again, showing that it is one important thing to assess. Now, what all the signs we elicited? A pulse pressure of less than 30 was present in 73 cases out of the 72. Positive tourniquet test was present in 33% cases who developed dengue shock, and 51 patients who developed dengue hemorrhagic fever. Once again, showing the importance of doing this test. It's a simple bedside test and it should be performed. Now, among the bleeding manifestations, petechial lesions were present in almost all the cases who had bleeding, that is all the 33 patients. And also good number of patients came with bleeding gum, either bleeding from nose or conjunctival hemorrhage. So, investigating these patients, who were divided into all the 4 types. Hemoglobin level, for dengue fever it was 10.8, which is almost normal. Dengue fever with low platelet count, hemoglobin was 11.2. Dengue shock syndrome, maybe due to hemoconcentration or other factors, the hemoglobin was 13.6. Mean hematocrit was also slightly increased in dengue shock syndrome. And deranged liver parameters was present in 94 and 87% cases of dengue fever. And decrease in albumin level of less than 3.5 was present in 59% of the cases. Now, based on chest X-ray, bilateral pleural effusion was there in 6 cases out of the 13 cases which showed unilateral pleural effusion. 3 patients landed up with pneumonia. So this slide shows there is collection of fluid in the right side. Another slide shows blunting of the both CP angles with pneumonic features. Another slide again shows right sided pleural effusion. In ultrasonography, fluid in the CP angle was present in about 76% cases over the left side and all the 100% cases in the right side, whereas bilateral collection was present in 31 cases. Fluid in the GB fossa was present in 39 cases, pouch of Douglas 25, renal fossa around 35 cases, and fluid in all these spaces were there in 23 cases. So this is one slide showing the right pleural effusion. Another slide showing the collection, a thin rim around the gallbladder. Another USG showing free fluid in the pouch of Douglas. So we had few patients who, along with dengue, had other comorbid factors. And the message from this slide is, whenever there is dengue with comorbid factors, the recovery period is usually more. The other cases recovered within 3 to 4 days, 5 at best. These patients usually took more than 2 weeks. Platelet administration. So it is important to note only 8 of the patients has received platelets. And people with platelet count of around 1 lakh to 1,50,000 dropped to 78,000 at best. And 73% of them has this drop. Remaining were pretty fine. People with platelet less than 25% was only 8. So those cases has received the platelet transfusion. To fluid therapy, when the pulse pressure less than 30, the evidence of fluid leakage, we give crystalloids at 6 ml per kg per hour. If there is no improvement, increase it to 10 ml per kg per hour. Still no improvement, go for 20 ml per kg per hour. If there is improvement in the initial stage, slow down the fluid transfusion rate to 3 ml per kg per hour and then discontinue. Platelet transfusion criteria for us was platelet less than 20,000 or platelet drop of 40 to 50,000 per day. Out of 70 cases of dengue hemorrhagic fever, platelets was given in only 4 cases. Convalescence patients, so is improved appetite and other parameters like renal output was also better. And for discharge, we had patients to be afebrile for 2 days with good vitals, no evidence of fluid leakage, and platelet in the rising trend. The best part of the study is the mortality rate was absolutely, the fatality rate was 0. That is, out of the 72 cases, no expiry has happened. Maximum presentation was with dengue shock 58, dengue fever 19, and dengue hemorrhagic fever of 23. So the message I would like to give is proper assessment, judicious platelet transfusion, and fluid management will decrease the mortality rate in dengue to a very significant extent. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Banerjee, I found that in your study, the incidence of shock, the prevalence of shock was round about to the tune of 56%. Yet
Yes,
in
sir.
your clinical presentations, there was no finding of shock in the patients. Do you think all the patients develop shock inside the hospital?
Patients were
See,
referred
there
with
was no mention of hypotension or cold and clammy extremities in your presentation of clinical findings.
in,
So do
in
you think
the
all the shock developed inside the hospital?
in the clinical findings we have divided into signs and symptoms. In that, low pulse pressure was one of the criteria which we have mentioned. And secondly, patients are usually referred with complaints of fever and other features. And on assessment, we find all these things. Good number of patients were there with shock.
In your findings of shock, I find that you always mention the low pulse pressure. Do you think that should be an important criteria, or do you think low systolic blood pressure should be a more important criteria? Because pulse pressure just reflects the difference between systolic and diastolic blood pressure. So a low pulse pressure, say a blood pressure of 150 by 120, that will also reflect a pulse pressure of 30.
Yes,
So
sir.
do you think systolic blood pressure should be given more attention rather than on pulse pressure?
We have taken the systolic and diastolic pressure for all the patients, in which patients suspected of having shock or there is evidence of shock. We have also measured the pulse pressure, and that has been tabulated here.
And I find that all of your patients did respond to fluid very well. How many of the patients required inotropic support like noradrenaline?
Of the 72 cases, not a single of them has any requirement of inotropic support. If there is early assessment of shock, the patient is going towards shock, and if the fluid is given judiciously without
Patients just
overloading.
responded to fluid treatment.
Patient has responded well.
Nice.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, participants. Congratulations to all of you. We are waiting with a bated breath for the results from the judges, which will be announced after 1 or 2 sessions. And thank you, judges, for all your suggestions. It is well taken by our students. Thank you very much. Now I request Dr. Avinash Krishna, the Chief Health Director of South Eastern Railway, to present a memento to both the judges, Dr. D. Panigrahi and Dr. Dipankar Ghosh Dostita.